This morning, David is going to take you through structural risk assessments and management, ensuring safety and compliance. A very topical element, I think, as part of the Building Safety Act at the moment. A lot of you will be aware for buildings that are in scope for the Building Safety Act, structural risk assessments, requirements for structural risk assessments, and the requirements of the accountability under the Building Safety Act is a huge topic at the moment. So hopefully, as part of today, we'll be able to clear up some of the outstanding questions that the industry and that you may have today. A little bit about ARC for those of you that don't know who we are. So we've been in the industry now for just over 30 years. We're working as a partnership with our clients, offering an end-to-end solution, dealing typically with the most complex, contentious and critical buildings and situations, offering our support to our clients. So the agenda for today is to cover off a little bit of an overview about kind of what has gone wrong when buildings do fail. So David will take you through some of the history surrounding structural collapse, disproportionate collapse over the years, and some of the problems that have happened and the reasons of why buildings will have failed. We'll then take you through about the legislation, so looking at sections 83 and 62 of the Building Safety Act in a little bit more detail. We'll talk to you about structural risk assessments versus condition surveys. So it's a question that we get probably daily here at ARC from our clients about the difference between structural risk assessments and actually condition surveys, what's required in both of them, what's guidance versus what's legislation. We'll talk to you then about managing structural risks in today's world and also giving you a little bit of guidance about how to utilize your building safety management system, but also leveraging technology in managing your risks. I think it's a hugely important aspect when it comes to building safety, assessing building risk, to be able to utilize technology and able to understand the management of compliance online. So to get you started for today, we're going to start off with a quick poll. So it would be great if you could participate. So it's a very, very quick and easy poll to get us started. Have you undertaken a structural risk assessment for any of your buildings that are in scope for the safety case reports that are over 18 metres? So yes or no answers. We will wait for your submission. And once the results come through, we will get started. So a lot of no's at the moment, David. You'll not be surprised to hear.
Yep. About 2/3. So
2/3. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Okay, and over to you, David. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all well. Name is David Hills. I'm a Senior Director here at ARC, dealing with regulatory, technical and technology solutions. I've been working for ARC for just over 24 years, but before that I spent a number of years as a local authority building control officer working on a number of major construction sites. I'm a chartered building surveyor, a fire engineer and a health and safety consultant. So I've got a good series of experience of both not only fire safety but also structural safety as well. So as Sean has said to you, I'm going to take you through a very quick history of why things have happened and what we've got so far. So we have to recognize that buildings fail. I can go back many years to the Colossus of Rhodes back in 226 BCE, all the way to the failure of the lighthouse in Alexandria in 956. But really what we want to focus on is notable residential structural failures. So what I've done here is actually just put together a very quick list of those types of buildings that have failed over time where a number of people have died. So we've actually had structural failures. These particular ones are exclude all types of collapses due to seismic activity. So we're not talking here about failures in respect of earthquakes, for example, but we could go back to 1968 and Ronan Point in London, where we had 4 dead and 17 injured, and we can move our way all the way through to Champlain Towers in 2021, where we had over 98 dead. And then just a few months ago in Dubrovnik, in Argentina, a place called Dubrovnik, we had another failure there. So we've had a significant number of residential failures across the globe, but I want to focus on these two to start with, and that is Ronan Point. And Ronan Point was a pivotal position and situation in the UK. It was constructed post-war. It was a large panel system, so they were effectively large panels pinned together to form the building. We actually had a gas explosion on the 18th floor. It blew out one of the load-bearing walls. And that effectively meant that each of the floors above, all that were supporting the flats, stacked onto the floors below, causing a progressive collapse. And out of that, effectively, we had changes to the building regulations that were put in place in 1970, and that lasted right the way through to a couple of years ago. And we've got, therefore, a lot of buildings in the UK that have been considered in respect of disproportionate collapse or progressive collapse, however you want to call it. But also there are a number of buildings, the older buildings especially, have particular concerns that we need to at least consider. Then, of course, a couple of years ago, 2021, Champlain Towers. And I'm going to take you through Champlain Towers in a little bit more detail here with some footage and an analysis of actually why it went wrong. But effectively, we've got a concrete frame building, we've got poor design, poor construction, a lack of drainage, and effectively we had half of that building collapse within 12 seconds. The final cause of that particular collapse is still being investigated, but there are some very, very clear and obvious issues. So one thing I would say to you straight away is that this is not down to a single issue. The simulation I just want to show you here comes from a gentleman called Mike Bell. You're seeing CCTV footage from an adjoining building of the building collapse. And as I say, that collapse takes 12 seconds. And what you'll see is through his simulation, we've actually got very poor design. So we've got a pool deck adjoining the building, underneath which you have a car park. And that pool deck didn't have any particular drainage. So water effectively went through the pool deck and started to corrode some of the reinforcement. And the reinforcement was poorly placed, and what we were starting to see is what's called punch through shearing, and the column heads were punching through during this particular failure. We had a bit of a catenary action here where we were pulling columns out, and then we actually had the structural collapse of parts of the building. Now, all of those issues were known about. The management company and the owners of that building had undertaken to review particular concerns, especially within the car park. They were told that there were drainage problems. They were told about concerns over reinforcing issues and water penetration getting into the car park itself, but nobody did anything about it, mainly because they didn't actually understand how important those particular concerns were. So that is what I really wanted just to show you very quickly about how things can happen. It's not normally just down to one thing. In here, we've got poor design, poor construction, poor management, and a complete lack of understanding of actually why and how things actually fail. So let's move on then. So we know that buildings fail, and they often fail for numerous reasons. But the Building Safety Act now actually requires us to start to consider the assessment of structural stability as part of building safety risks. Now, Section 83 of the Act basically states very clearly those who have accountability for a high risk building or part of that building. So you may not have total control over all of that particular building. They must assess the building safety risks as regards to the parts of the building for which they are responsible for. So that's a legal requirement. And I'm going to go back to the definition of building safety risks in a few seconds. But I think it's very important that that particular section then goes on and says that further such assessments must be made at regular intervals. It does not state the type of regularity. It does so state that they should be reviewed at a time that the accountable person believes that there is a reason to suspect that the current assessment is no longer valid. And on the third basis is that you must undertake such assessments at the direction of the regulator, and the regulator will then set and determine the period of that and the frequency of that particular assessment. So we've got to undertake these types of assessments, and we can't just believe that that assessment is going to be suitable and sufficient forevermore. We have to look at undertaking those types of assessments on a regular basis. Now, I want to quickly just jump back to building safety risks, this so we can square that particular circle. We have to assess all of those building safety risks, and building safety risks are defined as the risk to the safety of people in or about a building arising from any of the following occurring as regards to the building. And those issues are the spread of fire, which most people are actually understand, most people will get on with, most people have undertaken their fire risk assessments because of other legislation as well. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order in England, Fire Safety Scotland regulations in Scotland, for example. But it also says that we've got to consider structural failure and any other prescribed matter. So it's very, very clear then. The law requires that structural risk assessments for a high risk building is a very clear requirement of the Building Safety Act. What I would say, though, is that the definition of building safety risks is fluid. It can change at any time. The government has given themselves the opportunity to make those changes using statutory instruments, and so they can actually do that on a relatively quick basis. One of the questions we often get asked is, well, do we need to do this for all types of buildings? So I'm just very, very quickly going to take you through the fact that actually the only types of buildings that are or present the legal requirement for you to undertake a structural risk assessment are buildings that contain 2 or more dwellings or 2 or more rooms for residential purposes, or buildings that contain student accommodation, and that they satisfy the current height conditions, which is basically 18 meters above ground level, and or 7 stories. Now that could change over time. The recommendation within the Grenfell Tower inquiry report suggests that that may have to change, but we are where we are at the moment. That is the requirement at the moment, although it's an arbitrary figure, and the inquiry is looking for us to move to a different area. There is a possibility that the scope could change again through parliamentary process, and allows the Secretary of State, as I said, to make those changes in a relatively quick basis. So we understand that by April next year, we will have an understanding of where the government is intending to take the next stage of building safety following the Part 2 section of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. So there's a need for structural risk assessments in high-risk buildings. Those high-risk buildings are well known. So how do we go about undertaking structural risk assessments? It's a question we get often asked. The one thing that we always refer back to is the Institution of Structural Engineers guidance. They have produced a very good guide called Assessing Higher Risk Buildings under the Building Safety Act, a compendium of structural topologies. Now, this particular document is a really, really good guide, but it is a guide. There is a legal requirement for the structural risk assessment, but at the moment, this is the best way of actually undertaking that particular approach. Now, the guide itself makes it very clear that there are certain limitations. It says, for example, due to the open-ended nature of structural assessments for building safety cases, a degree of prioritization is required. And they base much of this on risk and on the type of building. They also to make it very clear that it will not be possible to assess every structural element through an assessment process, nor would it be appropriate to do so. And the guide also makes it very clear that the inspection recommended within their particular four-step process is not undertaken on an intrusive basis. I want to put a caveat on that late, and I've got another slide in a few moments' time to talk about that particular part. But the whole sole aim of this is to undertake an assessment of the building based on four very, very clear steps. Now, those four steps have been set out by the Institution of Structural Engineers. Talks about a desktop study and collation of information, continuing of that to review that information, a visual survey and inspection of the building, and then the actual assessment itself. So we are collating that building information, which is going to come from various different sources such as building archives. You might be lucky enough to get building control or information from building control. It's not always possible. You may understand or know what type of building you've got, and so you've got industry publications, and also you've got the website called Cross UK, which is a really good, helpful, safety-based database of concerns and issues that have been raised by various parties for different types of building. We've then got to identify the potential weaknesses. Now, these are the common weaknesses that the Institute has recommended that they considered, as well as very construction specific. And again, we can look through the guidance, and actually that will tell us what we should be looking for in certain types of building. Cross UK is exceedingly good, as I said, and also we need to rely upon the engineer's own experience. We then undertake that visual survey, and we are assessing the potential building weaknesses, looking for modifications to the building, to the design. Modifications, for example, are drilling holes through concrete beams for use for services, retrofitting services. That's the type of modification that we are obviously very concerned about. We're also looking for signs of obvious distress, and we're determining if there are any additional requirements, investigations or calculations that are needed. And then finally, we then identify, record those structural hazards and controls. And again, using all of the guidance that's out there, actually provide that assessment. Now, that process, as the Structural Institution of Structural Engineers suggests, is a cyclical process. So it isn't just a once only thing. We need at a later date to go back and start to collate more information. There may have been changes to a building. There may have been other requirements or other things that have happened to that particular building. And so therefore we need to now reassess that particular building structurally. Now, the Health and Safety Executive have produced some guidance, and they've been very clear. The regulator, who obviously sits within the Health and Safety Executive, have advised that the level and the extent or the intrusive nature of any assessment should be proportional to the risks. And so therefore we have to start thinking about the actual building itself, start thinking about the age of the building. The older the building, the more likely we've had changes to that particular building, the less likely we're going to have calculations. We need to start thinking about the design of that particular building and the construction techniques and methodologies that have been used. Are we using, for example, large panel systems? Are we using deleterious materials, rack, for example, or wood wool? And then obviously we've got to start thinking of the occupancy as well. It's not just going to be a case of buildings that were purpose built. We've got buildings that, for example, were office blocks that have been converted to residential blocks. So we have to start thinking about the level based upon those particular risks. But what the guidance makes it very very clear that whilst we can acknowledge and suggest that the Institute of Structural Engineers approach means that it's mostly going to be a visual or a non-intrusive inspection, the health and safety executive have made it very, very clear that it's acknowledged that there is going to be significant and existing building information that is going to be missing. And intrusive inspections may therefore be required. So we cannot rule out the fact that additional and intrusive investigations are going to be the findings of your overall structural risk assessment. So the guidance then, that's where we are with what structural risk assessments should be doing and the legal and the guidance that's sitting behind it. But just to give you a little bit of information, we actually, when we are undertaking our structural risk assessments for our clients, we take a look firstly at the common issues, the types of issues that will be common to all types of building. And I've no intentions of taking you through all of these. There are lots of them, but we have to start considering all of the elements here. One of the major issues that we're always concerned about is damp and water penetration because of the types and nature of the construction materials that have been used. And obviously workmanship and construction defects are, again, very, very important. But once we've considered the common issues, we then start having to think about the construction specific issues. So you're going to have, for example, load bearing masonry. It's not a hugely used approach, especially for very tall buildings, but we're going to have to start thinking about the mortar arrangements. We're going to be talking about lintels. We're going to be looking at roof spread and basically cracking within that particular type of structural arrangement. You're going to then start thinking about concrete framed buildings. Now, this is going to be probably the most prevalent type of construction for taller framed buildings, especially in the UK. And again, we start looking at jointing problems. We start looking at concrete cover issues, and again, water and damp penetration, spalling, etc. We also have to consider other elements. If it's a steel framed building, again, effects of cladding on the actual stability of that particular type of building, corrosion of the actual members. Again, damp penetration is so important that we check, and therefore checking things such as roofs, gutters, and any other types of leak are very, very important in respect of your structural risk assessment. And then we start moving into something it's growing as a nature. So it's a timber framed, or what we call CLT, cross laminated timber constructions. We do have a number of cross laminated timber constructions that are high risk buildings in the UK. And so therefore we have to start looking at load sharing issues. We have to start looking at service holes and notches and those other elements that have actually undertaken during construction. And then going back to the more 1950s, 60s and 70s systems, as there are some large panel systems elsewhere as well. And so we start looking at disproportionate collapse issues, we start looking at joint irregularity, and we start looking at other things such as, again, damp penetration and those other effects. So the structural risk assessment really does focus very specifically on the individual types of building. And so therefore you will get certain particular and more prevalent type of recommendations from those particular types of building due to that particular arrangement. One of the last things I just really wanted to talk about regarding the actual assessments themselves is the fact that we need to start thinking about the competence of those individuals that are undertaking it. Very clearly, the structural engineer must have sufficient skills, knowledge, experience, and the right behaviours. But the important elements here for the Institute of Structural Engineers is that they set out some very clear competence requirements, that the structural engineer needs to be able to understand the assembly of that building, how those individual components interact with each other, and the way in which the overall stability for that particular building has been designed and is maintained. That in addition, that the structural engineer needs to be able to understand that the building, how the building, has been built, and then draw conclusions from its general condition, such as crack patterns and distorted forms, where these are evident. And again, you'll notice this isn't talking about an intrusive survey. This is a visual survey that may later on suggest the need for other types of survey. And then finally, it suggests that structural engineers need to be able to understand that similar signs of damage may actually have different causes. So we certainly look for, in our team, for those who have experience of looking at buildings forensically, and looking at how we can reverse engineer and understand particular concerns. So that's the type of competence that we need to be looking at. We're not talking here about a property manager being able to actually undertake this on themselves. This is and does require a degree of structural engineering experience. Okay, so that's assessments. One again, Shauna was mentioning that one of the biggest questions that we tend to get is about the difference between a structural risk assessment and a condition survey. So I just really want to very quickly touch on a couple of slides about that and consider the differences between the two. So on the left of this particular diagram here, we've got structural risk assessments. Now, they are, as we can see, a legal requirement. We've got the Building Safety Act 2022 and the High Risk Buildings Management of Safety Risks, etc., England regulations of 2023. From that, we've got some guidance issued by the Institute of Structural Engineers, which effectively says that the actual risk assessment is a systematic process for identifying, analysing and mitigating potential risks to the structure's integrity. Now, opposed to that, we've got the use of condition surveys. Now, these are not a legal requirement. These will generally be part of your PPM system. And we have some guidance from the British Standards Institute, BS 8210 2020. There were previous versions of that going back to 2012, which is all about Facilities Management Code of Practice. And it basically talks about the condition survey being the act of measuring and recording data from operating parameters and to verify the condition and the trends relating to that building. And they recommend, for example, that a condition survey is undertaken every 3 years. And that particular guidance then refers you to another set of guidance, PD-CEN TS 17385, which takes you through the methodology of actually undertaking and assessing immobile constructed assets, buildings effectively, and the real need to go in depth into each of the components and the elements of that. So risk assessment, legal requirement, but it's subjective in nature. It does not assess every structural component. We look at the risks and we deal with this on a non-intrusive basis. They may recommend further intrusive investigations at a later date, but it's all based on a risk-based approach. Whereas the British Standard 8210 suggests that we need to consider every structural component. It looks not only at each component, but the elements that make up that component themselves. And we then start to have to provide a scoring mechanism against its condition, the severity and the extent of any particular issue to determine what's called a condition class. And if you get a condition class 1, great, it's excellent. If we get a condition class 6, then it's very bad. So worthwhile, I would suggest looking at this particular part, getting a condition survey undertaken. It does support your building safety case report. And as I said, this particular code of practice really will then take you into the individual elements and will support the whole process. We want to run another poll if we can. So over to you, Shauna, very quickly.
Thank you, David. So just to get your guidance a little bit more and to make this some interactive, have you undertaken a condition survey again for any of your buildings? So simple answer, yes or no, please. And we can start to see the results. Similar results, I think, David, from the structural.
Yeah, and I can see it moving, and I can see the fact that actually we're coming up to, obviously there's a greater degree of condition surveys that have been undertaken, which is great news. But we've got to see also the fact that condition surveys are not risk assessments. Condition surveys are great. They help us, especially when writing a safety case report, to outline to the regulator the condition, but it doesn't deal with the risk side of things. So yeah, almost 50-50, 55% have suggested that they haven't undertaken, but 45%. So as you suggested to me, Shauna, earlier, probably going to see a greater degree of a greater number of persons who have actually undertaken condition surveys. So that's as expected. Okay. Brilliant. So let's move on then. Just really want to finish this off today and start thinking about how we therefore manage risks. I think it's very clear that whatever we do, you cannot just assess a building. You have to manage the issues that are raised. And again, there is a legal requirement here. And I'm going to quickly run through the legal requirements. The principal and accountable persons of a high-risk building have got to take all reasonable steps to firstly prevent a building safety risk from materializing, so preventing structural risks from materializing. And if they do materialize, we've got to start thinking about how we can reduce the severity of that incident. In addition, the law requires and says very clearly that there may be steps that you need to take in order to achieve that particular requirement for the areas for which you're responsible for. So this isn't just a case of assess the building. We've got to therefore consider what steps need to be taken for that particular building to ensure the safety of the occupants, the residents, and others who may be affected. It then talks about management and prescribed principles. And I want to quickly go through the prescribed principles in a few moments, because again, it isn't just a case of dealing with individual risks in isolation. We've got to start changing our approach to looking at a whole host of layers of protection. The law requires that you must take those steps promptly. We can't just undertake an assessment, put it on a shelf and leave it till 3 or 4 years later, especially if it's got issues that need to be actioned. So we need to take those steps promptly. And finally, the actual law says very clearly that the accountable person must effectively develop a safety management system. And the regulator has produced guidance very specifically on this, which again, I want to just touch on in a few slides' time. Okay. So those prescribed principles effectively now detail how you as a principal or accountable person, or those who are supporting principal and accountable persons, consultants, contractors, property managers, for example, need to think about how we go about dealing with those steps that are required. Now, the prescribed principles are set out within the Higher Risk Buildings Management of Safety Risk regulations that came out at the end of last year. And they set out in order of effectiveness 10 prescribed principles that we need to consider when we start managing structural risks. And the first thing we've got to do is to avoid those risks wherever possible. Now, more often than not, you've got an existing building, so you're not going to be able to avoid those risks. So we need to evaluate those risks. So where they cannot be avoided, we now need to identify proportionate measures to address, reduce, mitigate, or control those structural risks that have been identified. We need to combat risks at source by, again, introducing those proportional measures to reduce, address, mitigate, and control any of those structural risks at the earliest opportunity. So prompt being so important there. We need to ensure suitable and proportionate systems are in place for effective inspection, testing, and maintenance of all of the measures that we've got in place. So we need, therefore, that assessment to understand what type of measures have been put in place already. So a lot of people believe that we should just be producing lists of actions out of structural risk assessments. Far from it. The prescribed principles makes us or needs us to understand what existing measures are in place so we can ensure effective inspection, testing, and maintenance. And as I said, we've got to start thinking about buildings as systems. We can't start looking at buildings in a silo basis. We have to accept that different parts of a control system will provide collective measures. And so therefore the principles require that we give collective protective measures priority over individual protective measures. Again, trying to move away from this silo approach. The last five prescribed principles means that we've got to adapt to technical progress. That's a technical progress not only in respect of constructions, but also the way that we deal with things and also what we're actually putting into buildings as well. So we need to address that and understand that. We need to make sure that if we have identified something that is dangerous, then we have a duty now to replace the dangerous with the non-dangerous, as they call it, or the less dangerous. So again, that's a control measure that we now need to start considering. We need to consider the impact on residents and carry out engagement with those residents. Most people are actually undertaking resident engagement strategies now, and so therefore that's an important part, but making sure that the risks are understood by the residents themselves as well. We need to make sure that we are giving appropriate instructions and information to our own employees and other persons who are working on or in the building. And then we need to ensure that any person who is responsible for assisting with compliance with a duty under what's called Part 4 of the 2022 Act, and Part 4 effectively deals with all of those actions that are required as part of an existing in-use building, that they have the relevant competence. So they are the prescribed principles, and the best way to actually look at that is, as I said, they are not dealt with as an individual process, or they should not be dealt with as an individual element. They cannot be dealt with in isolation. They provide layers of protection. So best way I felt that we could actually describe that is to look at those various layers of protection for one particular hazard. So I'm going to choose disproportionate collapse. Now, the first protective measure in the fact that we've got full structural calculations and a design that has taken that into account. And that design was undertaken by a competent person. So we've got those competence there. That actually we've ensured that we've got good and effective horizontal and vertical ties within the building. In addition to that, we've got a PPM program that's covering the structure and the condition of that particular asset, that particular building, and that the people who are undertaking that planned preventative maintenance program are competent to do so, and that management are competent and understand what's actually required. So as you can see, various layers of protection. Your program, your PPM program, for example, does rely heavily on understanding the building, at making sure that you've got the right competence of people involved. So it cannot be dealt with, as I said, in isolation. We must not deal with it in isolation. We have these layers of protection. And so therefore, when we are looking at structural assessments and structural risk management, we start to have to think about a holistic approach, making sure that we understand the whole of the building. And so we can't just think, okay, well, I've got a commercial tenancy on the ground floor, but I'm not going to include that in my structural risk assessment. because I'm only responsible for the rest of the building. But we need to understand what that particular commercial tenancy has, or what effect it has or could have on your particular part of the building. If it's, for example, a hardware store that contains butane and propane bottled gas, if those were to explode and we were to have a gas explosion, we need to think about how and what the impact on the remainder of the building is going to be. So we need to think about those numerous protective barriers. What's in place? And we're not talking here about force fields. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. So we therefore have to understand that we've got to consider the whole building as a system. And finally, when we have issues that are found, we've got to take the appropriate action where necessary and do it promptly. Okay, so that's the requirements for us in respect of how we go about managing. Let's quickly talk about safety management systems, and then we can answer any questions that you may have in respect of structural risk assessments. So safety management systems and structural risks is a really important part here. It isn't just about making sure that we've undertaken our assessment and we're carrying out those actions. Though those control measures that will be identified within your structural risk assessment will require you to undertake certain actions at a later date. Inspections of your building, for example. But let's just quickly go back to what the law requires. The law basically states that you have got to give effect to arrangements for the purpose of ensuring the effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring and review of the steps to be taken. As the health and safety executive have made it very clear, this is about developing your safety management system. And your safety management system, therefore, is going to consist of certain parts. If you follow the recommended approach, which is based around plan, do, check, act, and it's all set out within the guidance on safety management systems from the regulator. And effectively, we need to set out that statement of intent. You need that policy statement. So what is it that you're going to do, and why are you doing this? You need to make sure that we understand who is responsible for doing what within your particular building. Clear roles, clear responsibilities. We then need a series of procedures, policies, arrangements, whatever you want to call them. They could be flow charts, they could be written, detailed instructions, but it's all about how you manage. So we need those for your management activities, as well as undertaking fire risk assessments, but obviously we've now got to include structural risk assessments and the ongoing management of the outcomes of that risk assessment. And in addition, you're going to have other policies and procedures for building management, building and equipment maintenance and inspections, and also undertaking things on a proactive and reactive basis. Your management system needs to be able to deal with what's called mandatory occurrences. Excuse me. So that's the management of fire and structural safety occurrences. Now, they are not the same as RIDDOR. Whilst we can treat them similarly, they are not the same. And there is different reporting mechanisms and different management requirements in respect of mandatory occurrences. There is a need to make sure that reporting up to senior management is in place. Section 161 of the Building Safety Act requires managers in organizations who own these types of buildings to ask the right questions, to receive the reports and to do something with those reports. So that approach needs to be there. And the question I always ask clients is how are you managing these processes? What type of systems are you using? You've got all of these procedures, but how are you managing those risks? How are you managing the evidence to be able to prove that you've done everything reasonably practicable? And so digital management systems are more and more becoming a necessity, especially for those organizations who have more than one building, even those who have one building. managing a whole host of risks that come out of any type of risk assessment, be it fire, structure, water, COSH, you name it. You're going to have a number of actions that need to be taken, and you're going to have a number of solutions to dealing with that proactive and reactive requirements. So we would strongly recommend you look at digital management systems. The guidance recommends that you look at digital management systems. Dame Judith Hackett, right at the very beginning, going back to 2018, she actually recommended that we need to be looking at digital management systems. I can only show you one digital management system because I only have access to our own version. We produce a system called QUOODA. So this allows you to produce dashboards so you can determine your compliance levels. You can start to consider your risk assessments and manage those individual risks depending upon the nature of them, and ensure that you understand exactly where you are. But then we've got to start thinking about storing all of this information and making sure that we undertake this on a regular frequency. So again, using grids and for particular elements, and actually just allowing us to store documentation and ensure that you've got all of that information in one place. A single source of truth is a really important part to effective building safety management systems. Okay, just coming to the very end now, but we would like to run another poll if possible. Over to you, Shauna.
Thank you, David. The last poll of today, and then we will take some questions from the audience if you have any. Will you now be considering undertaking a structural risk assessment for your buildings as part of your requirements under the Building Safety Act?
Yeah, as we would expect, clearly there's a legal requirement to undertake it, and therefore we're looking at a significant number of people. And again, I would imagine people have already undertaken, some have already undertaken structural risk assessments. We've undertaken structural risk assessments on behalf of a number of clients. So that's not to be the figures we're seeing there are to be expected.
Definitely.
Okay, just really want to just conclude, if I can, before we take any questions. So the key takeaways from today, I think we've got to accept that buildings fail. Buildings deteriorate over time, and it's never normally down to one thing. So we therefore need to be very holistic in the way that we approach this. And structural stability relies upon a variety of different layers of protection. And so therefore we need to, when we're undertaking our assessments, to make sure that we're considering those different layers of protection. And then when the building comes out of that assessment, and we may have a number of steps that need to be taken, be it finding calculations, be it undertaking intrusive surveys, or actually mending parts of the building, then we need to actually understand where that fits in as a collective rather than on an individual basis. And I think it's really important that we understand that we're not just talking about structural risks resulting from design and construction failures. What we have seen in our experience, it's also about property management action that's been taken and sometimes inaction as well. So it's really important that we get to grips with that particular part as well. It's across the design, the construction, and the way that we manage on an ongoing basis that particular building. So property managers really do need to understand the results of a structural risk assessment. And now I'm not going to suggest that property managers are not competent to do this, but the one thing I would say is that property managers must ask questions. They must make sure they fully understand what the impact of a particular step that's being recommended or a particular action that's actually required. You really do need to understand it. That was one of the major issues at Champlain Towers. We'd had 3 sets of reports telling us particular concerns, but nobody asked the actual structural engineer to turn around and say, well, what does it actually mean? What could happen? just because someone turns around and says that it could corrode the reinforcement doesn't sometimes compute to everybody. So we do need to ask those questions. As I said, structural risk assessments are a legal requirement, especially for high-risk buildings under the Building Safety Act. We are seeing some organisations decide that they're going to do it for smaller and smaller sized buildings, but there is a legal requirement for that. Just finally, in respect of our experience, the building safety regulator is asking questions. They are seeking clarifications regarding structural risk assessments from owners, especially when they are assessing a building safety case report. It's very interesting. They do focus very heavily on the structural side, mainly because it seems that some of the safety case reports that are submitted to the regulator don't tend to focus sufficiently on structural safety. You have a legal duty to manage the outcomes. We've dealt with that. So you do need a management system. And as I said right at the very end there, technology can be leveraged to help you manage those risks efficiently and effectively. Okay, Shauna, any questions?
Thank you, David. Yeah, just one question, and more might to start coming. So you've mentioned when we were looking at assessments versus condition surveys that the frequency of a condition survey is typically around 3 years. What would be the frequency of completing a structural risk assessment? Now, you've covered it very easily that we know it's a legal requirement, but do we need to review that structural risk assessment?
I think you need to review that structural risk assessment on a regular basis, and I would suggest that that would be based on a risk to the building. So if, for example, we have found particular concerns or damp or water penetration into particular areas, then you may move that frequency up to, again, to perhaps 3 years. You may decide, actually, do you know what? The building is brand new. We've got very little issues, and we can start to look at that every 5 years. So it really comes down to the risk. But of course, if you've got issues or you've got changes to that building, then you need to be able to deal with those changes at the right time as well. So that assessment may be required after a particular piece of work has been undertaken on the building. And of course, the regulator at the end of the day has also the option to turn around and tell you to undertake your structural risk assessments at a frequency that they decide. So it's flexible. We would strongly suggest 3 to 5 years, depending upon the nature of the building. If it's a building that's got a number of problems, then you may want to bring that down to 18 months or 2 years.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question with regards to buildings that are older. So if we're taking maybe a building 1920s, the structural information may not be as readily available for those that are of a newer build. Is there any tips or tricks that you can kind of give the attendees in order to try and find or locate this information?
Yeah, the most successful one is especially the older buildings pre-1984. All of those buildings would have had to have gone through a local authority. Now, we do know that local authorities have changed. They've changed their names. They've changed the locations and the areas in which they cover. But local authority building control or district surveyors will or do hold information. Now, it isn't always going to be there. You're not always going to find everything about a building. Certainly, as an ex-building control officer, the local authority I used to work with, we were taking all of our information back to 1880, and we were scanning it and putting it on microfiche, for example. But certainly local authorities are a good idea to go to, especially for older buildings, as well as having a look at the website Cross-UK. Again, a very, very useful website that may help us understand any particular concerns with types of buildings that we're actually talking about here.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's it for today, David. Thank you very much for taking us through such a complex aspect of the Building Safety Act. We will be releasing copies of the slide and the recordings to those that have attended today. So thank you very much, and thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.